Okay, I'm sending it to the live stream on YouTube.
Okay. Okay. Hopefully we'll have some more people show up in a minute and go from there. So, um, trying to get my screen to. There we go. Okay, so today we're going to be looking at the next passage, which is actually found in Romans. Going to be Romans. We're actually going to look more than just Romans 27 and 26 and 27. We're going to kind of go through the whole rest of the chapter, starting with chapter 1, verse 18. So, okay, one more thing. There we go. Okay. So we're going to start with Romans chapter 1, verse 18. We're going to read down through 32, but with that, we're not going to talk in depth about all of it. We're going to focus mainly on verses 26 and 27. So, the reason why Romans is such an important thing, the reason why um, we focus on this and we look at this chapter is like the chapters in Leviticus. It has been weaponized so much um, that it has really brought shame on a lot of people. I mean, it's the way these verses are used. They're used very similar to the verses in Leviticus and even the verses in Genesis. And with that, if we read them carefully, look at the Greek, look at the structure of the way things are worded, I think we can tell that it's doesn't quite say what a lot of times people have said it says, if that makes sense. So, Paul's goal in writing this section is not about condemnation, and we'll see how that looks in a minute. His goal is actually found in Romans 2:1, which says, "Therefore, there is no excuse." And then he gets to chapter 3, and he says, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." So, Romans 1 is basically could be seen as a mirror or as something for people to look at and compare themselves to, compare their lives to. And then when we get to Romans 2, then we see that he's saying that with all of this, with all of these different things that people could be doing, there's really no excuse to say that God doesn't exist, no excuse. And then we turn to chapter 3, and he comes in and says, "Now, for all have problems, all have continue to have issues. However you want to interpret that." So the manuscript that we're going to be looking through is actually going to be Romans 1:18 through 32. And I have several slides. I didn't, we've been busy all day today, so I didn't have time to delete some of my slides. I was going to try to consolidate them, but that didn't happen. So Romans 1:18 through 32 says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived even since the creation of the world, and it's the things that have been made, or in the things that have been made. So they are of none excuse. For although they knew God, they didn't honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and exchanging the glory of the immortal God for images of resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore, God gave them up to the lust of their heart to impurity, to dishonor their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creation rather than the creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. And then here's the two verses. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind and to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with a manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They were full of envy, murder, strife, deceitfulness, um, maliciousness. I hate those words sometimes. They're gossips, slanders, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, worthless, or ruthless, not worthless, ruthless, though they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die. They do not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. Okay, that's a huge passage. But for us to understand exactly where Paul is going with this, it's important for us to kind of see where Paul is leading. And so, chapters 1, 2, and 3 of Romans is actually talking about it. It's what they call a diatribe. It's basically three sections of passage where Paul talks about separate things or important things that he wants people to understand. And so when we begin reading those verses in chapter 1, we see that Paul is revealing universal human sinfulness. He starts out at the beginning of chapter 1 talking about neither Jew nor Greek. And he's basically says that no matter who the person is, they're not exempt from God's judgment, not exempt from God's wrath ultimately in what Paul is saying. Now, all of that being said, he then begins to list off things talking about different types of things like murder and lying and ruthlessness. And he lists all of these things, saying that all of these, that people that he was talking to resembled all of these different things. And most of the time, we don't really in the church look at all of these other things that he mentions as much as we focus on the verses that we always say, well, this is talking about sex, this is talking about same sex, this is talking about. And so, because of that, that's the area where people tend to turn. And if we look at number 2, chapter 2, Paul then turns the argument on the hearer. It's kind of like if you look at the book of Amos, where Amos is talking to the people of Israel, and he says, all of these other countries have done these evil before God. And then he turns it back on Israel, saying, but you have also done evil before God. Well, that's what Paul is doing in this diatribe, is he is saying there's all of these different things. There's the liars and the thieves and the murderers and all of these different people. And then he turns it back on the hearer and talks about them as saying, you're part of this problem. You are part of the people that have been doing this also. And he does this as a way of trying to get rid of people's self-righteousness, trying to avoid the fact that most people have this mindset of, oh, well, I'm not as bad as so-and-so because I don't do this. I've never murdered anyone, so I'm not as bad as that person. Or I've never stolen, or I've never, whatever the situation is. And people try to use that. Well, Paul is saying you can't use that because maybe you didn't murder, but you did lie, or maybe you didn't do this, but you did do this. And so he uses this as what we call a rhetorical trap, and basically is an attempt to make them realize that they're no better than anyone else. And with that, then he gets to chapter 3, and he clearly points out that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And then finally, if you go ahead and jump to Romans chapter 5, then we find out that while the wages of sin is death, that the gift of God is eternal life. And we find that God has, instead of just penalty for people, he has love for people, and that's the most important part. And so the gift of grace is what he talks about in chapter 5. So all of that being said leads us back to, well, then why does he mention in these two verses specifically talking about women leaving their natural desires and men leaving their natural desires and seeking out passion with one another? And so the verses actually say, for this reason, God gave them up to a dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving themselves the dual penalty of their error. So in these verses, he's laying a groundwork for people to look at and see where they fit in, basically, to the story of the gospel. And we find that most people consider Romans Paul's version of the gospel story. And while he doesn't focus strictly on the crucifixion of Christ, he focuses on the fact that Christ came to save people, no matter what their ungodliness was, that he came to save them from all unrighteousness. And ultimately, Paul begins talking about this social breakdown that the people were going through. So, in verses 19 and 20, we begin with natural revelation. And in those verses, basically, Paul is saying, he says, for what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived even since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So there is no excuse. Now, you probably heard a lot of preachers use this before, saying that that's why the Aboriginal tribes, or that's why the tribes in the Amazon, that's why the tribes here or there cannot say, well, I didn't know that there was a divine being, because through creation, through what God has created, he's shown that God has shown invisible qualities, including divine power or divine nature and eternal power. And Paul uses this as a way to tell his listeners that they should recognize that there's something more, something greater than than just themselves. And when we begin to kind of have that self-worship where we're focusing so much on ourself that we're no longer focusing on that there's something bigger out there, whether we look at it as being God or being the whole of humanity, or however we perceive that divine eternal nature, Paul is trying to say that you should know that there's something bigger and greater than just you. That just from observing the natural world around us, we should be able to recognize that there's something beyond us. And with that, he makes this profound statement. He says that God is plain to be seen, and that God has shown power and divine nature. And Paul argues that God's nature is seen in his power, his divine nature, and in the reality of everything that we can see around us. Now, it's hard for me not to refer to God as a him. So if anybody gets offended at that, I truly apologize. That's not my intention, I promise. I'm just so used to that because that's, you know, anyway. So God reveals God's self, or God reveals himself through creation. And humanity has access to God because God has been revealed to them. So Paul is saying that humanity then has to be held accountable. And the reason they're held accountable isn't, and he goes through and he lists all of these different types of things that we would think of as sin. But he actually states that the reason they're held accountable isn't ignorance, but because they suppressed the truth. So the people were suppressing the truth that was revealed to them. And so because of that, That's the thing that they're being judged for. That's the thing that God is holds against them, is because they're suppressing truth and unwillingness to acknowledge God, unwillingness to truly truly see God for who he is. Okay. Now, from there, Paul goes on to say, I think it's this next slide. Let me go to it. Okay, so the diatribe. Okay, so he then begins to talk about things like the glory of idols. And you'll notice that whenever I was reading that, it actually says that they have taken things like birds and other creatures and created for themselves idols instead of worshiping God. So they were worshiping creation instead of the creator. He also points out lies and how they have traded the truth to believe things that weren't true. And again, they shifted their worship from worshiping something that created all things to something that was created by God. And then he moves into this third exchange of talking about the natural relation of things and the natural order, which that's where our passage that we're focusing on begins. So, verse 26, it says, again, for this reason, God gave to them dishonorable passions. For the women exchanged natural relations to those that were contrary to nature, and men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Okay, so his argument is simple. He says that they rejected God. He says that they lost basically their moral compass, what the truth that they should have been following after. Instead, they began to follow after lies. And then he moves on to begin talking about being passionate and enslaved in excess. Now, in most English Bibles, it doesn't bring that out. It doesn't quite interpret the Greek in such a way that we can see what those words mean. And that's what's crazy to me. That's one thing that really bugs me about a lot of English translations is because they tend to word things based on other English translations. They're supposed to go back to the original Greek and say, "Hey, this is what this says," but instead they like to make it easy and just say, well, this other English translation said it this way, so that's how we're going to word it also. And it's important for us then to kind of look at what's going on in the Greek and Roman culture. Okay, so the Greek and Roman culture, they had sexual norms that were very different than the modern day sexual norms. And as we talked about with the Jews last week, even the last couple of weeks, there was no concept of homosexuality. There was no concept of mutual love from one man to another man or one woman to another woman. Instead, there was this concept of um, exploitation, which is something we've been talking about for a while because each time that this is brought up, there's this idea of exploitation. He talks about pedastry, which I that word pederasty. Anyway, which is different actually than pedophilia. And let me see where it's at. Well, anyway, this idea is where someone would have a young adolescent age boy, and in a way of kind of a quid pro quo type relationship, they would take these young boys that were past maturity, they were adolescent age, teenage, and they would make them their slaves basically for sex. Now, that being said, they would also offer them education, offer them a status among the people. And so basically, they would find a young man who had already gone through puberty, basically, or were going through puberty, and they would take that person, offer them an education, offer them social status, and they would be their consort, their young sexual partner. And then as that child grew up and aged out of that adolescent range, then that child would actually take another child that was in the adolescent age, teenage range, and continue this process. And this was very common in the Greek and Roman worlds. We can see this in the movie Alexander, if you've ever watched it. Alexander has a young man who's supposed to be probably around 16 or 17 years old come to him at one point and they sleep together. And that's what we're seeing. It's this desire to be with a young man who was innocent, but who was fully a man. And we'll talk more in a minute about the difference between that and pedophilia. So, because I want to make that very abundantly clear that they're not talking about pedophilia. They're talking about something very similar, but not quite the same idea. Also, they're talking about slave exploitation. And we've talked about this with the Old Testament passages. The masters had access sexually to the male and female slaves. And it wasn't about consent. It was about, you're my slave, you're going to do what I tell you to do. You're my slave, I'm going to force you to do this, and you can't say anything about it. Temple prostitution. Again, many of the temple prostitutes were slaves, but temple prostitution, much like the Old Testament, were sexual acts that were tied to pagan worship. And often this was done as a form of exploitation. People were forced into temple prostitution. Some chose that life, I guess, but most of them were forced into some type of prostitution as a worship of the pagan deity. And then we go back also to the status-based sexual acts. And this had continued from the Canaanites all the way into the New Testament. We find men who would find men of lower stature, lower status socially, and they would have sexual relationship with them. And for the Romans, they were okay, much like the Canaanites were, they were okay for a man of higher status to be the sexual active one, and the man of lower status to be the passive role. And as long as the Roman citizen was not being the passive role, then it was completely fine in their social circles. But it was about power, and it was never about affection. Also, it says lust-driven excess. And the word that we have here in the Greek is orexis, and it means a burning or uncontrolled desire. And this word in the Greek is never used anywhere in both secular and biblical texts to talk about some type of loving, passionate desire. Instead, it's a lustful desire that is much more than love. It's that burning desire that someone would have of lust. Now, the word itself refers to something in excess. So if they were filled with greed, then they could have this lustful, this orexis nature towards money or towards items. So Paul's explaining here that first there was a level of wanting things in excess. It was not about love. It was not about a relationship. It was about a lust-driven excess. It was also exploitation. There was no mutual consent. There was no, I'm in love with you, so I consent to this relationship. It was about committing a sexual act, usually based on status and power. The Roman citizen over a person who's not a citizen, or the master over a slave, or something along those lines. And this could be talking about both men or women. These words are used to explain both relationships of men with other men, men with women, and then women with other women. And so Paul is using all of this as a way to help the Romans understand what he's talking about and understand how this relates to this newfound belief of Christianity that they're focusing on, that they're accepting. Now, the difference between pederasty, that word is so weird to me. The difference between that and pedophilia is pederasty means, or anyway, it means that the person, the younger individual, has matured sexually. They have passed their regular puberty time, and they are fully masculine, body hair, things like that. I mean, so it's very, to me, it's important to understand that this individual is not a child that is completely without any type of uh, sexual maturity at all. This is talking about an adolescent to teenage boy that was older, and usually between ages 12 and 17. Now, in modern standards, that's still wrong. Okay. In modern standards, most people still consider that pedophilia. And but for the Roman people of that time, and I'm not saying that I agree with, I mean, I feel like it's wrong because they're still, can't really give consent. Anyway, needless to say, the Romans didn't promote pedophilia. They didn't promote having sex with children, but they were okay if the child was past that sexual maturity in their eyes, at least they believe they were, past that level of sexual maturity, they could become one of these young consort of someone who was in leadership, whether it be a king or we're talking about Rome, so emperors or other leaders of other kinds, and even people who just had a higher social status. They accepted this type of relationship. And so that's what Paul is trying to talk about. He's talking about this exploitation that was going on amongst the people, either because it was a younger person, or it was a slave, or someone of just a lower social class. And so this is where the Greek comes up. This is the part that I enjoy. This is the part that I always talk about. So the first word is translated in English as dishonorable passions. Another word, another way of explaining that is degradable impulses. And basically, it's not talking about an identity. It's not talking about something to where someone has a sexual identity. It's talking about someone who is wanting and desiring and burning for this sexual relationship with this person. It is a level of excess. Nowhere in it does it ever have any concept of a sexual identity, sexuality, anything like that. It's a burning, lustful passion. The next word in the English is translated as traded or swapped in some cases. And it actually is very similar to the word for metamorphosis, where something is changed from one thing to another. And this word it's metalaxon, and it means to exchange something, to take something that is inborn and change it through active choice to something that is not innate. So most people, when they read this, say, well, while gay men are innately attracted to men, there is no swapping. There is no, oh, well, I was attracted to women, but now I'm attracted to men. It's they're attracted to men, and because they're attracted to men, that is an innate orientation. Well, metalaxon means to take something that is not innate, something that they're not born with, and make an active choice to swap out for something that was not born in them, something that was not innate in their personality and their character. And so this word doesn't refer to someone who is innately attracted to other men. It's saying that basically these emperors or leaders who were already married, who were seeking after women, lustful for women, are now turning their lust through a conscious effort towards men. And I mean, I don't know about you, but that doesn't explain that. That is not the definition for being gay. Being gay, we know of, is something that's already there. It's not something that's a chosen exchange. Then we have natural use or natural function that we find in the English translation. And this means the customary practice. It has nothing to do with biology. It has nothing to do with the biological design or biological needs of someone. It is just something that is customary to the people. And the Romans had a lot of sexual customs that were not at all like the Jews. And Paul, being a Jew, he was going to talk against all of these things that were customary to the Romans, but were not customary to the Jews. And so when this word natural use or natural function is brought up, he's referring to things that the Jews would see one way, but the Romans, it would be a customary practice for them. It would be something that they didn't mind doing, like the being with the adolescent boys. That was something the Jews were completely against, but the Romans were okay with it. Or to seek out someone who was of a lower social status and to force them into a sexual encounter without their consent. And so that's why Paul is talking against these things, is because they are against Paul's understanding of the Jewish version of Christianity. Then we get to outside. Here's another word. It's paraphyson, and it means outside of the customary practice or something that is unexpected. It's basically very similar to the word we just used, but the idea again is used to talk about something that is outside of what the cultural bias is. And the Jews had a very different cultural bias than the Romans did. Then the word we're talking about a minute ago, the orexia, and this word can be translated as a burning desire or craving or lust. This word is never used in the Greek New Testament or in Greek secular writing, anything to do with love, anything to do with marriage or covenant or a relationship. It's basically the idea of taking someone without their consent, such as rape or some type of forced sexual encounter, that the individual that is having it done to them has no ability to say yes or no, that they are okay with this. It's something animalistic, basically. If you think about how one animal might take advantage of another animal, well, it's that type of burning desire, to where it's something that is not, the other individual is not able to say no, I don't want this, I don't give my consent for this. And then we use the word aphintes, which means abandoning and or leaving behind. Again, it comes back to this idea of they had their innate nature, but now they're leaving their innate nature by choice, moving to a nature that is foreign to them. And we talked about that a minute ago with one of the other words. And you'll notice here that even though different words are being used, they still all basically mean the same thing. We have two different words here that mean a burning type desire. You have two different words that mean or excess, like having too much of something. You have two different words for meaning swapped or traded, and choosing something that is not innate to take on a nature that is foreign. And then we have two different words that both mean to follow a practice that is not the customary cultural practice of the time. And each of these, none of those words say anything about what we know of in today's society about homosexuality, about being in love with another person. None of those words are ever used in that context. And again, the Romans and the Jews of this time, they would have had no concept of two individuals of the same sex having a loving relationship with one another, because it was always for them about power. They didn't have sex with another man just to have sex with another man. They had sex with another man because they either had a wife and they wanted some type of consort on the outside, aside from their wife, or they wanted to force their power through humiliation over someone lower than them. And it's the exact same stuff we see coming from the book of Leviticus and coming from the book of Genesis that we read about over the past few weeks. Okay. Before we go any further, anybody have any comments or any questions about that? That was, I know, a lot of information, but I feel like this verse is kind of harder to look at without actually looking at the words, because it has been used so much. So any comments or anything y'all want to say first? I'm not sure who else is here. Oh, Adam's here. Hey, Adam. So any comments or anything? Anybody? No, everybody
Well,
good? Okay.
they're just, I mean, I just find it interesting that that's what it all comes down to, is looking at the context and the society that they're in. And when we're talking about um these verses, and my first initial thought was, okay, why is it this the thing that Paul's talking about? Because it's so prevalent, I guess, in that area, that he needed to bring it home with these things that people understood, right? Not that just that he was just pulling it out of a hat, but it would have to mean that they were focused on these types of things in that society, so that he felt necessary to bring it up, right?
Mm-hmm. And you're absolutely right. First of all, a lot of things do have to do with looking at the culture. And there are a lot of areas of the Bible that people don't ever look at the culture that led to what was being written. I'd read something the other day, and we may have even mentioned it. We may have mentioned it last week in Leviticus, um, that the writers of the Bible, for instance, looking at the book of Matthew and the writer of Matthew saying, this was to fulfill the prophecy that such and such spoke that said he will be born in Bethlehem, or he will, something like that. Well, if you could really look at the original writer of the Old Testament passage, there's a big probability that they never meant what Matthew is saying that prophecy that they're fulfilling is. They were just making a statement about whatever's going on. And a lot of times we find that even in the biblical, like the New Testament context, that there are the glasses that we read them at from 21st century America is completely different than what the Jewish reader and Roman reader would have read whenever they were looking at this. And so for us, trying to look at it from 2,000 years of being told that being gay is wrong, it means completely different to a society that was basically using young men between the ages of 12 and 17 as sexual consorts, so that they didn't have to have sex with their wives and get them pregnant or whatever. Having these sexual relationships with prostitutes that were a way of worshiping this idol. And so we don't have that context in today's society. That's why I pointed out the thing with the pedophilia. In today's society, we look at that even through age 17 as being pedophilia. So to us, that concept of them wanting to have sex with these young men was completely foreign to us. And then even more than that, we don't have, I don't know of any type of temple prostitute in 21st century I mean, there may be some place across the world, but honestly, I don't think anybody in today's 21st century can really say that they quite understand this idea of temple prostitution, because we don't use sex as a way to worship a pagan deity. And I mean, if you want to get down to it, and you look up the original Yahweh that we find in the very first part of the Old Testament, Yahweh itself actually was a lightning deity from one of the northern kingdoms. And then the Jews began using that terminology for God. And so there's all of these concepts that we see from 2000 years later that's hard for us to truly see what that person was trying to say. Um and so yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. We looking at it from the lens that we have to look at it from, we have to take the context and the surrounding verses and the culture of the people before we can really truly grasp what's going on here. Any other thoughts or comments? Any other thing?
Maybe don't.
Adam, if you're talking, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me? Hello? Am I there? Can you hear me?
Or I can't hear you.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
I can hear you a little bit, but
Hello? Am I talking now?
very little bit.
It's all good. Keep going. Y'all are awesome.
Okay, it's coming through louder now.
Well, cool. I guess I was just. We don't really have a concept for idol worship that would be like going to a temple and worshiping a statue. But I do think, I mean, we tend to interpret that today. There's all sorts of things that we do make idols of, um, and I think in the same sense, and the whole LGBTQ community is catching a stray here, but I mean, Paul is talking. If sex involves just objectifying and then using someone else without their consent for your own pleasure, that is kind of idolatrous in that you're kind of making the idol of yourself and harming someone else for your own gain. It's not thinking about sex in terms of anything mutually consenting or any affection at all. It's um I mean that's what he's talking about, and it just kind of just randomly gets put on one group of people and not every other human being that's ever existed, you know? It's kind of weird.
Yes, I love that you brought that up, because you're exactly right. The idea of that forced sexual act where there is no consent, whether you think of it as rape or molestation or assault or whatever, that's wrong no matter the culture. That's wrong today as it was then. That was something that he was talking bad about then. But like you said, the church has tried, or not even the church in general, I mean, just people of today's society have tried to say, oh, this is talking just about gays. Well, actually, it's not. It's talking about individuals that were forcing themselves on other men. You could actually turn it to say they were forcing themselves on other women, and people would not blame it on gays anymore. But because the way it's worded, it immediately is turned against gays. So yeah, you're exactly right. And I'm glad you brought that up, because it is. It's about, the issue is about power and consent. It's not about mutual love for another person. So with that, with those different things we've talked about excess, meaning that they were seeking it through this lustful, burning desire, and they just couldn't have enough, unsatisfied type. That doesn't describe an identity. Nothing about that word describes an identity. They were describing exploitation, and exploitation again means no consent. It's type of assault, or being forced to do something they don't want to do, even if it's not technically an assault, but they're being forced to do it. Then there's, like you said, there's the idea of idolatry, and how you can have sex as an idol, but again, that doesn't talk about orientation, it doesn't talk about partnership, it doesn't talk about identity. And then Paul here is talking about a status-based domination of one person who is high-ranking, forcing someone who's below them to do these things, even though they may not want to. And that's not talking about mutual respect and love. That's talking about dominance and force and power. So and he does mention this idea of swapping something from someone's normal nature to something that is out of their normal nature. So basically, and what a lot of scholars see this as is people who are heterosexual, who had their wives, they had their female consorts, whatever, and then they begin having sex with other men. And it doesn't have anything to do with having an innate gay desire. It has to do with them just choosing, hey, I'm going to have sex with this other guy instead of have sex with my wife. And so it's not about orientation, it's about leaving or choosing to do something different than what is their orientation. So in this list, and as we talked in the very, very beginning, he also talks about things like greed and envy and murder and strife and deceit and gossip and pride and cruelty and lack of mercy. And so he's not just focusing on these sexual parts of the Roman culture, but he's also listing out all of these other things. But we normally don't hear this passage used for that, right? We normally hear it talking about the sexual side, and that's where the focus is. Okay, and then again, kind of ending it, we get to chapter 2, where Paul again turns it back on the people who are reading it. And he says basically, and you guys, or there is no excuse for you either. And it's the people reading this probably weren't struggling with this type of sexual domination. They, if anything, they were the ones being dominated, basically, because he's probably writing to a bunch of people in the lower class or the middle class and not the high end people. But with that, he then turns it back on them and says, but you don't have an excuse either. You know, all of these other things that I've listed, lies and stealing and murder and all this, and you don't have an excuse. But then he ties it back to God's grace and how everything goes back to that God has love for individuals. And with that, there's the unmerited favor and grace that God shares with us. So Paul's message is he's not speaking to the LGBTQ people, even though they're the ones that modern day churches tend to use this scripture to focus on. Instead, Paul's message was never about gays. Paul's message was about grace. Paul's message was about people that fall short on doing the things they should do, and that God loves everyone, no matter who they are. No matter if they're the lowest person, the slave, or if they're the emperor, God still has a love for that person. So we're coming up right to the end of our time. We normally cut off about 45 to 50 minutes. So anybody else have any other questions or comments that you'd like to make before we go? Give y'all a chance to say something. If are y'all good? Okay. Well, ultimately, again, I think we see a pattern here, at least to me, I see a pattern here that these ancient cultures, whether we're talking about the Canaanites, the Egyptians, because Leviticus mentions the Canaanites and the Egyptians, the Greeks and the Romans, which is who Paul is talking to because they were Hellenistic culture, all of these cultures had this dominating sexual concept. And we see that even as far back as Sodom, where they were wanting to force humiliation on someone else, not because they had a loving mutual relationship with that person, but because they just wanted to humiliate people to say, hey, I'm bigger and badder than you are. And so all of these cultures have had the same concept. That's what's built into their culture. And again, it's hard for us in today's society to truly grasp that because we don't really see it as much. And when we do see it, it's usually hidden in some type of assault or something like that. And so we don't think about it as being what it really is. So to us, these verses don't talk about the gay population at all. They're talking about people who were forcing domination and power on other people. And so, last time, does anybody have anything you want to say? Are we good? Okay. Well, guys, thank you all very much. We'll see y'all again next week, and we'll talk about the next passage, which is found in Corinthians. So thank you all. God bless, and y'all have a good week.
Bless you too. I'll miss next week, but I'll see you the week after. See ya.
Well, I will have it. I'll have it recorded and posted on my YouTube, and he should have it on the church's YouTube also.
Cool. I'll check it out.
Thank you. See you
See ya.
later.